and welcome to the 2017 Beshara lecture. It's our great pleasure to welcome George Pattison to be with us today. George has come down this morning flown down from Glasgow to be with us, where he is the 1640 Professor of Divinity at Glasgow University. George has actually got a very, very long history of contact with Beshara. I discovered that actually his time of contact has been greater than my own, being more than 40 years now. He's been in contact, and of course the original contact was through his great friend Adam Dupre, sadly deceased, who was very involved in Beshara for many years. George has had a very distinguished career. He was at Cambridge, and he was for many years the Lady Margaret Professor at Oxford University before moving to Glasgow in 2013. He's also got a very impressive list of publications to his name, and over the years has established himself as one of the UK's leading theologians, with a particular interest in Kierkegaard and Heidegger, and close to our own interests, he has in recent years become a champion of the revival of mysticism as a topic of academic study. And those of you who read the Beshara magazine will note that we attended a conference called Mysticism in Comparative Perspective, which he put on last December in Glasgow, and then very kindly gave us an interview on this important topic. He tells me that today, at the moment, his next publication he's working on is going to be called Existentialism and Mysticism, and his topic today, Nothingness and Gratitude, is kind of the fruit of this lifetime of work on all these different aspects of theology. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and to remind me of the conference in Glasgow, and thank you also to those from Beshara who not only came but a number gave presentations of quite different kinds, in fact, and it was a great asset to the conference to have that involvement. I know my colleague from Glasgow, Lloyd Ridgeon, has been down to speak at Chisholm as well, so I hope these are, Jane mentioned sort of having had connections going back 40 years, but I hope there are also connections going forward, not only as it were in my own person, but also obviously Glasgow is somewhere well placed to have contacts with Chisholm, and I hope this continues. So, nothingness and gratitude. And when I was asked to give this talk, there was no set agenda, so I was asked to talk about anything I wanted. And this is an issue that has come up for me in some current writing I'm doing, perhaps of more general interest, so it seemed like a good opportunity to give it an airing and to work through the issues involved. Nothingness and gratitude are basic themes in religious or spiritual life in all of the world's major religious traditions. Being religious is often described in terms of knowing oneself as nothing before God, and God being everything, and at the same time being grateful to God for all that we receive from him. Both of these seem kind of very basic elementary building blocks of religious life, yet logically it seems there's a contradiction between them. Why do I say that? Because in order to be grateful, I have to be someone. That is, someone capable of receiving divine gifts. Someone who has something to thank God for. Who has, for example, a life, an existence, a being that I owe to God. And if God has taken the trouble, so to speak, to put me here, to make me the person that I am, in the time and place in which I am, who am I to say that I am, after all, nothing? Has all God's efforts been wasted? Now, this could seem like quibbling over words, but what's at issue lies at the roots of some of the defining differences between major religious traditions, at least as popularly perceived. I underline that. In non-esoteric Jewish, Christian and Islamic monotheism, we're presented with the image of a personal creator God who has made the world and all that therein is, who has made each and every creature in that world to be what and as it is, as a specific part of God's whole plan, cosmological and historical. Everything has its place. In this perspective, whatever problem there may be in clamping an Aristotelian framework onto scriptural monotheisms, the medieval theologians of all three traditions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, were perhaps intuitively right in seeing a certain analogy or fit between the Aristotelian view of the human being as a certain kind of substance, a real something, an entity, and the scriptural view of God as creating and entering into relation with concrete individualized persons whose actions in historical time are of decisive importance for their eternal salvation. In contrast to this view, Buddhism and Vedanta, for example, contextualize what they perceive as the nothingness of the individual self within a cosmological and metaphysical framework in which, versus Aristotle, nothing has any essential substantial being. Everything is a play of relationships, grounded, if grounded is still the right word, in limitless emptiness. The difference perhaps is analogous to the difference between Newtonian and quantum physics, between a universe made up of things and a universe in which ultimately things are a perspectival illusion, a play of light on the great ocean of becoming. But this isn't just a matter of difference in worldview or cosmology. It also has implications for how we conceive, even how we practice, religious life itself. If we follow the line of scriptural revelation, everything hinges on what these concrete, historically active persons whom God has created do in and with the lives that God has given them, whether or not they are faithful in all the detail of their social and individual lives to the covenants he's made with them through Noah, Abraham and Moses, and in the Christian version, through the life, passion and death of Jesus Christ. In these terms, religious life requires not only knowledge of ourselves and of God's will for us in general terms, but of the quite specific doctrines and demands concretized in scripture and tradition. On the alternative view, Buddhist, Vedantist or other, all that happens in concrete historical time is entirely relative. Salvation comes not from doing the right things, but from realizing that nothing we do, or could possibly do, has any permanent effect on the way things are. Rather than striving to fulfill the law and to be active in love, spirituality becomes a matter of letting things rise and pass away without attempting to impose our narrow individual will upon them, letting it all be. It's a difference between action and non-action, or between a religious ethics of moral demand and an ethics of compassion, perhaps a difference between plurality and unity. So it seems plausible then that our two words, nothingness and gratitude, epitomise two essentially different religious worldviews and two essentially different conceptions of religious life. And certainly that would fit well with some of the typologies of religion, popular from the beginning to around the middle of the 20th century, that model the religions of the West and the East on, respectively, the gratitude and nothingness paradigms, the former, the Western religions, being described as prophetic or ethical, the latter as mystical. Now, I don't myself want to make any grand claims about global religious traditions, not least because I think when we look away from the headlines, as it were, to the actual practice of religion in daily life, in individual spirituality, there are so many exceptions to any rule that we're likely to come up with as to undermine any broad generalizations we might make about West or East. Indeed, it's a matter of fact that West and East have been in some degree of mutual interaction for several millennia, and at quite an intense level for several hundred years, as evidenced by the way in which some of the great propagators of Eastern religion in the West Vivekananda, Iqbal, D.T. Suzuki, for example, interpreted their own traditions through the lens of Western philosophy, which they had all studied and understood intensively. That they then represented these interpretations of their own traditions to Western readers as offering balm to the one-sided distortions produced by Western rationalism may be mildly ironic, but it does serve to show the impossibility of cultural isolationism in the modern world, going back, as I say now, several hundred years. As far as Christianity, Judaism and Islam are concerned, the picture's further complicated, or perhaps illuminated, by the way in which all three have deployed the inheritance of classical philosophy, notably Plato, Aristotle and Stoicism, in developing and interpreting their own theologies. And of course, if we go back to Platonism itself, we find scholars, specialist scholars, debating whether, for example, the mystical element in Plotinus is an expression of his authentic Platonism, or, as some claim, as it were, a corruption of pure Platonism by Eastern mystical influences. So even back then, as it were, one could have those kinds of debates, and interactions have been going on ever since. So there's no neat east-west. I shall largely focus on this lecture on materials drawn from the Christian tradition, because that's the tradition to which I myself belong as a religious practitioner, as well as the tradition to which most of my scholarly work most directly relates. However, not only for the reasons I've just indicated regarding the permeability and mutual interaction of major religious traditions, but also because I've personally been in receipt of innumerable insights and assistances from non-Christian traditions, I regard this Christian focus as being without prejudice or privilege with respect to other traditions. Indeed, the very first theological lecture I ever heard, to which I was taken indeed by Adam's parents, his father being the parish priest of the parish where I grew up, was by the great Goan Jesuit Raimondo Panikkar, whose own theology involved a fusion of Hinduism and Christianity, and later on Buddhism. Panikkar literally embodied, being multi-religious in a way that showed extraordinary personal integrity. People who, as it were, draw on different religious traditions are often accused of eclecticism or syncretism, but in someone like Panikkar, these different traditions were lived out with entire personal and spiritual integrity, as was all clear to all who encountered him. I was also early on struck by the thinking of John S. Donne, an American scholar of religion who died in 2013 after a career spanning 55 years spent entirely at the University of Notre Dame, which is one of the most prestigious theology faculties in the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, Donne developed the idea that we can best understand our own tradition when we've experienced what he called passing over into another tradition before returning to where we began, and seeing it transformed by the light of what we've experienced elsewhere. We can, of course, say that's true of life in general. It's maybe only when you've lived abroad or away from home or something like that that you really appreciate what you had at the beginning. But that doesn't make it less true in religion, as many seem to think. And as I've said, our historical religions have been passing over into and out of one another for many centuries, and we are entirely free. I think we'd be well advised to be doing the same ourselves. Turning then to my specifically Christian sources, it's immediately striking that despite my opening comments, there are, in other words, saying that Christianity belongs to, as it were, a gratitude type of religion, thanking God for making us and for his providential gifts for salvation, there are nevertheless widespread, strong currents of Christian spirituality in which the language of nothingness is well to the fore. Probably the best known example is that of Meister Eckhart, as in his sermon on Matthew 5:3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," in which he states that the truly poor person is, quote, "someone who desires nothing, knows nothing, and possesses nothing." Commenting on the poverty of desiring nothing, Eckhart warns, "As long as you have the will to perform God's will and a desire for eternity and for God, you're not yet poor. They alone are poor, who will nothing and desire nothing. This leads into one of his more theologically controversial passages, culminating in the often cited injunction to ask God to free us from God. In this condition, we must will and desire as little as we willed and desired before we came into being. In other words, we must be as entirely dependent on God as we were in the moment in which we first came into being, or even before that, in the moment in which the idea of our particular individual existence first arose in the mind of God. Likewise, knowing nothing means, quote, that we should be as free of self-knowledge as we were before we were created, that we should allow God to do what he wills, and that we should be entirely free of all things. We must even surrender the idea of there being some special place within us, as mystics often speak of, in which God acts in a particular way. Instead, we must let God himself be the place in which he can act. Quote, if God finds us this poor, then God performs his own active work, and we passively receive in ourselves, since God works within himself. In fact, Eckhart goes even further. In preaching on Acts 8:9, which is about the conversion of St. Paul, and when St. Paul is struck down on his journey to Damascus, it says, Paul rose up from the ground and with open eyes saw nothing. Eckhart offers a fourfold interpretation of this nothing, of which the first is perhaps the most far-reaching. Quote, when he rose up from the ground with open eyes, he saw nothing, and nothing was God. For when he saw God, he calls that nothing. Now, of course, Eckhart's teaching was on the verge, or beyond the verge, of what was officially allowable within the medieval church, and after his death, a number of his teachings were formally condemned, culminating with the proposition that all creatures are a pure nothing. Nevertheless, despite Eckhart's condemnation, the theme of becoming nothing continued to find expression in Christian spiritual writings in the centuries that followed. We find it in the writings of Johannes Tauler, one of Eckhart's closest followers, in the anonymous Theologica Germanica that influenced Martin Luther, the German reformer, in the Flemish 14th century mystic John Ruysbroek, in whom we read that, quote, contemplation is always accompanied by an exercise which is devoid of particular form or mode. This is a life in which we ourselves come to naught. For where we go out of ourselves into darkness and modelessness that is unfathomable, there shines the simple ray of God's brightness always, in which we are grounded, which draws us up out of ourselves into the super-essential being and the immersion of love. And this immersion is always linked with and followed by a modeless practice of love, for love cannot be idle. It wants to know and taste to the full the unfathomable richness that lives in its ground, and this is a hunger unstilled. One cannot leave it nor grasp it, one cannot do without it nor obtain it, one cannot speak about it nor be silent about it, for it is above reason and understanding and above all creatures. But we should look into ourselves. There we feel that the Spirit of God drives us and kindles us in restlessness of loving, and consumes us to nothing in his own self, that is, in the super-essential love we are united with and possess more deeply and more widely than any other thing. It's from a work called The Sparkling Stone. Important here is how Ruysbroek connects nothingness also with love, a point to which I shall return. At the same time, such teaching continued to be suspect in the eyes of church officials. Another significant spokesman for the importance of nothingness was the 17th century Spanish theologian Miguel de Molinos, who wrote somewhat succinctly that the path by which to walk to that high state of the reformed soul, by which one immediately arrives at the highest good, at our first origin and our highest place, is nothingness. But Molinos, like Eckhart, would be condemned, and his teaching, called quietism by its opponents because it asserted that the soul could become entirely passive in relation to God, became the focus of one of the most bitter controversies in the Roman Catholic Church in early modern Europe. No mainstream theologians took Molinos' side in this dispute, although the French bishop Fenelon came close, as when he wrote, that, quote, "there are only two truths in the world, that of the allness of God and the nothing of the creature. So for humility to be true, it is necessary that we pay continual homage to God by our lowliness and remain in our place, which is to love and to be nothing." His writings too would be condemned, though less harshly than those of Molinas. At the same time, within Protestantism, the early 17th century witnessed the remarkable authorship of Jakob Böhme, an uneducated shoemaker from a provincial town in eastern Germany, who fused Christian teaching with elements of Kabbalah, probably, and some alchemy, to create a vision of dynamic theogony in which God himself is envisaged as emerging out of a primal nothing that Böhme calls the Ungrund, the non-ground, that is the sole primordial reality. So where classical Christian teaching spoke of God creating the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, Böhme seems almost to turn this image on its head and depicts both God and world proceeding from the nothingness of this original Ungrund. Again, Böhme predictably faced considerable opposition from church authorities, though his writings exercised a broad, though often obscure, influence on a succession of thinkers in the following centuries, including in Britain the Anglican spiritual writer William Law and William Blake, profoundly influenced by Böhme. Indeed, he was really popular from the beginning in England, and all his writings were translated into English by 1640. And during the Commonwealth, one of Cromwell's supporters, he was very popular with members of the New Model Army, petitioned Parliament that all of Böhme's works should be statutory reading for students in Oxford and Cambridge. But that one didn't get through. How different things might have been. The 19th century, interestingly, saw a huge surge of interest in Böhme and Eckhart. Indeed, and there's a huge silence of about 400-500 years regarding Eckhart, and during that period, there weren't many works in circulation with his name on. But from the early 19th century, scholars began to identify particular works as Eckhart's. Either they'd been published under other names or anonymously or mouldering as manuscripts in various monasteries. And a friend of mine just recently, within the last 5 years, discovered a new, hitherto unknown manuscript of Eckhart in a library in Germany. So these things were lying around, but they were just uncollected and unidentified. So Eckhart was sort of discovered in the early 19th century, and this contributed, I think, to a revival in what we might call the lost history of nothingness within Christianity. So it's in this kind of context that Kierkegaard, whom Jane mentioned, makes nothingness a central theme of his spiritual writings. In one of his religious discourses, To Desire God is a Human Being's Highest Perfection, Kierkegaard tells a story about a self that grows dissatisfied with being merely an instrument in the service of obscure desires, a part of the world or nature prompted to do this or that by instinct or passion or desire, and instead of being a centre of self-directing conscious freedom. So this self tries to get a grip on itself, as we say, to master itself, to take its life in its own hands, and then discovers that this isn't so easy. In fact, Kierkegaard seems to think it's impossible by definition, because no one is stronger than themselves. So the outcome, as he describes it, is like a wrestling match between two exactly equal combatants. In such a situation, the self cannot do more than fight itself to a standstill, an impasse in which it eventually annihilates itself. But, he adds, this annihilation is his truth. He who is himself altogether capable of nothing cannot undertake even the smallest thing without God's help. That is to say, without being aware that there is a God. And he who knows from his own experience that he can do nothing at all has every day and in every moment the wished-for and incontrovertible opportunity of experiencing that God lives. To know that he is nothing is his truth. It is truth's secret, imparted to him by God. And in the acceptance of his nothingness, he comes to know God. Kierkegaard offers variations on this theme at many points. One image he uses on several occasions, which might be Eckhartian, is that of the sun being reflected in the sea. But as he points out, this can only happen when the sea grows still and quiet. When the sea exerts all its might, it's impossible for it to reflect the image of the heavens. Even the smallest movement means that the reflection isn't quite pure. But when it becomes still and deep, then heaven's image sinks down into its nothingness. I think that's a very kind of Baltic image, actually. I don't know if any of you spent a lot of time on the Baltic, but sort of particularly in summer's evenings, and there's a particular kind of translucency about the sea, which you just don't see in the seas, or very rarely in Britain's coastal waters, and you really can't tell the difference between the sky and the sea and where one ends and beginning. It's just like pure glass. So I think he has that very Baltic experience of light and ocean in mind. He finds an eminent biblical figure for what this means in human terms in the sinful woman of Luke chapter 7. Some of you may remember the story. This woman bursts in on Jesus when he's at a dinner party in the house of Simon the Pharisee, famous painting of it by Rubens, falls at his feet and begins to wash his feet with her tears, to dry them with her hair and anoint them. The assembled Pharisees are all very shocked by this because they know that she is a sinful woman, though, well, we can guess the sort of sinful woman she was. And it says, if he was really a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman she was and he wouldn't accept her like that. But Jesus comments that her sins, which were many, have been forgiven since she loved much. So Kierkegaard writes about this woman on a number of different occasions, and he describes her as someone who is entirely taken up with one thought. Quote, everything else had become indifferent. Everything temporal, earthly, worldly. Honour, dignity, good times, the future, family, friends, the judgment of others, and she bore every care lightly, whatever it might be, almost as if it were nothing, because only one thing unconditionally concerned her enough to care about. Her sin. Although, as he shortly after adds, this isn't quite right, because the one thing she really cared about was not her sin, but finding forgiveness. Added to this, she's also described as someone who realizes that in relation to this one all-consuming concern that has, as it were, absorbed all of her life, her one great passion, that in relation to finding forgiveness, she herself was able to do nothing at all. She enters in. She fully understands that she's able to do nothing. Therefore, she doesn't give herself over to passionate cries of self-accusation, as if this might bring her closer to being saved or make her more well-pleasing to God. She doesn't make an excessive fuss, and truly no one could have accused her of that. No, she does nothing at all. She's silent. She weeps. In the 20th century, partly thanks to Kierkegaard, nothingness would become a major theme of existentialist philosophy. Although, as we find it in Sartre and Heidegger, it seems to have a very different meaning from what it had in the Christian mystical tradition. For Sartre in particular, nothingness is precisely the characteristic of human subjectivity that annihilates the world of given experience in order to reshape the world according to its own freedom. Sartre describes the human subject as an upsurge of nothingness in the midst of being in itself. As such, for Sartre, it becomes a marker of radical dualism and the separation of the human subject from its world. Nevertheless, another major existential thinker, Martin Heidegger, could turn to none other than Eckhart, and specifically Eckhart's notion of Gelassenheit, in order to clarify his own view as to how we should best orientate ourselves in relation to the world. Gelassenheit isn't an easy word to translate. One popular translation amongst philosophers is releasement, but I'm not sure what that means. Gelassenheit, anyway, means something like being let be. That is, being let be into a state in which we ourselves let be, letting whatever arises arise, and whatever passes away pass, no longer imposing our own constructions of subject and object onto the flow of life. but because of the structure of the word, it's not just that I let things be, but that I've been let be. I've been galassin. I've been released into this state. Interestingly, Heidegger was from early on in his career in close contact with several Japanese scholars studying in Germany, and the interface between existentialism and mysticism resurfaces in the Kyoto school in Japan, for example, in which the traditional Buddhist concept of nothingness is reinterpreted through existential philosophy. In Kyoto school thinking, the individual's experience of his or her essential nothingness is simultaneously a revelation of the nothingness that's the true reality of all things, absolute nothingness. God on this view isn't the object of religious experience, but the place, basho, of experience, as such a no thing. Yet it is on the basis of this no thing, on this empty place, that everything that is occurs. The emptiness revealed in the experience of Satori isn't something on the far side of human life, an other shore, to use the language of traditional Buddhist teaching, but an absolute near side, a nothingness in which we ourselves, along with all things, are always already placed. However, this Buddhist claim that individuals' experience of their own nothingness reveals the truth of beings as a whole pinpoints a certain ambiguity in the language of nothingness as we found it in the Christian tradition. For it is, after all, possible to interpret this language as perhaps only an especially vivid or even extravagant way of saying what Paul already said in his letter to the Galatians, that, quote, if anyone thinks himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. Now that probably isn't a philosophical statement regarding the true cosmic or ontological condition of being human, but simply a moral recommendation that we shouldn't think excessively highly of ourselves, that in a word we should be humble and not think too much of ourselves. Understood in this way, speaking about the annihilation of the self, of course, seems much less problematic in a Christian point of view. It's simply the ultimate expression of the logic of humility, and as such resonates with a virtue that Christian writers of all schools and centuries have insisted on. In the late medieval treatise The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, that has been a classic source for Christian devotional practice, à Kempis states that a true understanding and humble estimate of oneself is the highest and most valuable of all lessons. For the 17th century Anglican Jeremy Taylor, it is the great ornament and jewel of Christian religion, that whereby it is distinguished from all the wisdom of the world. And strikingly, it's in commenting on humility that Bishop Fenelon made the comment about being nothing that I previously cited from him. The connection's made clear in a fuller version of the same passage. All the saints are convinced that humility is the basis of all the virtues, because it's nothing other than the truth. There are only two truths in the world, that of the allness of God and the nothing of the creature. So for humility to be true, it's necessary that we pay continual homage to God by our lowliness and remaining in our place, which is to love and be nothing. So we seem then to have two lines of understanding nothingness. One which we might call cosmological or ontological, the other a matter of attitude, a sort of moral orientation. In the perspective of scriptural theism, it's only the former that's likely to be suspect. The latter isn't only acceptable, but is repeatedly endorsed and emphasized, as in such well-known biblical verses that remember, man, that you are but dust. From dust you came, and to dust you will return. This is simply a recognition of human humility. But can this distinction really hold? Bishop Fenelon, again, not only connects nothingness with humility, but in his philosophical writings goes on to offer a view of the human self as found essentially in nothingness. Although we're capable, as he says, of knowing the infinite, and he's living in the 17th century, a contemporary of Descartes, and he understands at least something of the new mathematics and new kind of speculation, so we can conceive this idea of infinity. Yet we ourselves are nothing. Behold the prodigy that I always carry within me. Being nothing, I am a nothing that knows the infinite. The radicality of this view was noted by his contemporaries, including the philosopher Malebranche, who wrote criticising Fénelon to none other than Madame de Maintenon, the second wife of Louis XIV. These were the days when royal personages took interest in this kind of thing. Malebranche wrote, "The point on which almost the entire work depends is that the habitual state of the soul is nothing." This, in Malebranche's view, is to undermine the whole basis of any science, because any science that assumes with Aristotle that each thing that exists is what and as it is by virtue of being a particular substantial entity that we can define and know. Fénelon's vision of the nothingness of the self, by way of contrast, points at least by implication to a world that's not constituted as a complex of interacting entities, but a world in which the relationship is prior to the relata, the things to be related. Now, in the 17th century context, maybe physics was on the side of Malebranche in this dispute, that the world was made up of lots of things. And Fénelon's position could easily look like nihilism. But today, perhaps, we've learned to be less Aristotelian, at least in our science. I'll come back to that at the end. Leaving questions as to the interface between spirituality and physics to one side, I know it's an issue that many people here find particularly important and fascinating. I do too, but I just don't understand it very much, so I leave it to one side. It's striking that Fénelon's theology also illustrates what I've suggested is the either-or character of the relationship between nothingness and gratitude. As we read through his spiritual writings, we'll find much that emphasises the dependence of the human being on God, that this isn't played out in terms of gratitude. The topic's hardly ever mentioned. The reason for this can be found in his advocacy of what is known as the pure love of God. We've heard Riesbrook make a connection between nothingness and love in speaking of a modeless practice of love. And we find this connection again in Fénelon. The key idea in the doctrine of pure love is that we're not to love God for the sake of the rewards and punishments that he can dole out at the Last Judgment, but for his own sake. The idea was sometimes illustrated in 17th century writings by reference to a medieval legend from the Chronicles of the Crusades by Joinville, of a Palestinian prophetess who was seen walking about in the city of Acre, carrying a pail of water and a file of fire. When asked what she thought she was doing, she replied that she wanted the water to extinguish the fires of hell and the fire to burn up paradise, so that no one would be able to love God for the sake of winning heaven or avoiding hell, but solely for the love of God himself, which probably lies behind the words of a well-known hymn popularly attributed to St. Francis Xavier, which begins, some of you may know this, "My God, I love thee not because I hoped for heaven thereby, nor yet because who love thee not are damned eternally," and which ends, it kind of rhymes, and ending, "Not from the hope of gaining aught, not seeking a reward, but as thyself has loved me, O ever-loving Lord. So would I love thee, dearest Lord, and in thy praise will sing, solely because thou art my God and my most loving King." Fénelon's own dramatic illustration of this doctrine is given in a thought experiment, in which he imagines a soul, at the very instant of death, who realizes that God has either decided to condemn it to hell or to condemn it to oblivion. And yet, in that very same moment, not wavering in its love of God, continuing to love God with all the fervour with which it had loved God throughout its life, without qualification, free from all considerations regarding any benefit it could possibly get from this love. Now, all of this, of course, was very controversial in an age in which religion was a significant form of social control. When challenged as to why he insisted on sending his servants to church, although he did not believe in God, the 18th century rationalist Anthony Collins replied so that he would not be murdered or robbed in his bed. In other words, the church existed in order to instill the fear of hell into the lower orders, or perhaps encourage them in virtue through the hope of heaven. If, however, we're to love God for God's sake alone, it would seem that there's little place for gratitude, since it's not for the gifts God has given, or may in future give, that we're to love him. The God relationship has nothing to do with what has been called a gift economy, in which the giving and receiving of gifts is a primary means of establishing the networks of social obligation that hold society together, the kind of economy of which the movie The Godfather is a vivid example. And perhaps it's not coincidental that Adam Smith, the great theorist of market economies, was especially effusive in praise of gratitude and expressly argued that this was central to the glue that held society together. It was because people were giving benefits to each other and were grateful to each other for the benefits they gave that society works. Now, the worry that such gift economies are inherently violent, and not just in Godfather societies, was perhaps what led behind the more recent philosopher Jacques Derrida's argument that for a gift to be truly a gift, there must be no giver, no recipient, and no gift. Now, at first that sounds like nonsense, but it's perhaps not as paradoxical as Derrida deliberately made it appear. For if a gift really is to be a gift, then it must be a gift. That is, not something that puts the one who receives it under obligation to the giver for. Consequently, the giver of such a gift must conceal their own role as giver so as not to place an obligation on the recipient. Indeed, such a giver must even conceal his or her own knowledge of being a giver, since that might allow them to entertain the idea that the other is under some kind of obligation that could, in principle at least, be called in at some later stage. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, a text that Derrida actually cites in support of his own position. And by the same logic, of course, the recipient shouldn't even be aware that what has been given is a gift. Now, if all of this sounds rather abstract, let's think about a kind of experience we probably all had as children when some visiting uncle or aunt gave us a present, or let's say a tie or a doll. Unfortunately for Uncle Ken or Auntie May, it wasn't a tie or a doll we either liked or wanted. We hung our heads and didn't burst into spontaneous thank yous. Our parents, embarrassed and perhaps aware of our discomfort but mindful of propriety, insisted that we say thank you nicely to Uncle Ken or Auntie May for the lovely present. Eventually we forced out a reluctant muttered thank you Uncle Ken, thank you Auntie May, and family honour was satisfied. In such events, and there are many of them, social order is gained at the cost of individual integrity. There is coercion and there is violence, even when all is smiles. But this is precisely the case of a gift that has to be seen as a gift, in which the giver is identified as a giver, and the recipient as a recipient, obliged to give thanks for what the giver has so graciously given. In such gift-giving, we're in no doubt as to who holds the reins of power. Derrida's logic is an invitation to try to think otherwise. And yet, gratitude, it seems, isn't an unworthy moral emotion. Some of you may recall the old evangelical hymn that urged congregations to count your blessings, count them one by one, repeated, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. I mean, it's not a bad exercise if you're feeling a bit depressed. Recent psychological research suggests that the systematic practice of gratitude really does contribute to greater happiness. In one experiment conducted over 10 weeks, participants were divided into 3 groups. One group were asked to write about 5 things they were grateful for in each week. That was all they were asked to do. Another group, the second group, was asked to write about 5 hassles they'd experienced in the course of a week. And the third, just about any 5 events or circumstances of whatever kind had affected them in the same period. The results suggested, I quote from the findings, that participants in the grateful group felt better about their lives as a whole and were more optimistic about the future than students in both of the other comparison groups. In addition, those in the grateful condition reported fewer health complaints and even said that they spent more time exercising than controlled participants did. So, gratitude can be good for you when not forced. As in the case of Uncle Ken and Auntie May, it would seem to reflect and encourage a positive attitude to life, to be an, as it were, expansive emotion, enhancing our openness to all that life has to offer. But how does this relate to the kind of forced gratitude we're so often inducted into as children, and that perhaps I think many people also see as typical of certain kinds of theistic religion, that we have to line up and thank God for the good gifts he's given. Maybe one way of making sense of this is to distinguish between two different senses of gratitude, between what a Benedictine monk David Steindl-Rast has called gratitude as thankfulness and as gratefulness. Gratitude as thankfulness is precisely gratitude for gifts that are presented as gifts, gifts that require thanks to be given to the giver. Now, even though, despite Derrida, Uncle Ken and Auntie Mo, we can envisage situations of this kind in which thanks is not forced, in which the giver generously renounces any present and future benefit or payback, gratitude of this kind, even in the best case, is always going to be limited in scope. If life deals me a good hand, if I have repeated experiences of such gifts, I may, over time, develop the kind of overall openness and optimism that the experimenters reported in their subjects. Nevertheless, in principle, such gratitude extends only as far as the gift, but not to life as such or a whole. By way of contrast, gratefulness is a basic attitude to life as such and as a whole, what Brother David called transpersonal, universal gratitude. Now, depending on our understanding of moral psychology, we might think that the best way to develop such transpersonal, universal gratitude is, of course, through repeated, especially childhood, experiences of thankfulness, arriving by a kind of Pavlovian conditioning at a more generalized view of the world as something to be grateful for. If this is correct, then being taught to say thank you as children is indeed a good first step in the formation of our spiritual life. Why not? Pavlov, interestingly, though a Soviet scientist, was a Christian believer. And when asked by one of his Soviet colleagues as to why, as a man of science, he persisted in going to church, he said it was precisely as a psychologist, because he realized that this made him a better person and a happier person through this repeated offering of thanks and devotion to God. Conversely, we might think, of course, that it's the other way around, that it's only if we really do have this transpersonal, universal gratitude that we will ever really be able to give a wholehearted thank you for any gift. That, if your basic attitude is one of gratitude, you'll be really thankful for a glass of water as much as you would be for a crate of champagne or whatever. Anyway, that's a kind of matter of detail, and leaving that to one side. So we might now be in a position to see why an exponent of the pure love of God might have serious reservations about figuring the God relationship in terms of being grateful for the particular gift God gives us, because it makes the God relationship into a kind of economic exchange. But gratefulness, as opposed to thankfulness, doesn't seem to conflict with pure love of God in the same way. In fact, we could understand it as a way of affirming that what we love in loving God's love is intrinsically good, that there is joy in it. We may be nothing. Even the universe as a whole may be nothing, in the sense of having no underlying or unifying ontological principle. But the event of our existence and of the universe, as it arises in and through and around us, is an occasion for gratefulness, for joy. Something like this seems to me implicit in a beautiful passage from one of Kierkegaard's upbuilding discourses. Now, it might at first seem that the passage is promoting thankfulness, since in the manner of the evangelical hymn it lists a series of blessings for which we might thank God the giver. But it's striking that Kierkegaard, who in his own way affirms the pure love of God, doesn't use the word thanks, but joy. The passage is a meditation on the Sermon on the Mount, and the passage where Jesus says that we should be like the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, that take no thought for the morrow, that do not work, and yet are fed and clothed. Kierkegaard writes, "Can anyone really be serious in thinking that what the bird and the lily are joyful about, or that what it is to be like them, is nothing worthy of joy? So the fact that you exist, that you came into the world, that you exist, that today you've got what you need in order to exist, that you became a human being, that you can see. Just reflect on the fact that you can see, that you can hear, that you can smell, that you can taste, that you can feel, that the sun shines on you and shines for you, and when you grow weary, the moon comes up and the stars are lit, that winter comes and all of nature changes its garb and takes on a strange new role and does so to please you, that spring comes and the birds return in numerous flocks and do so to give you joy, that the green shoots spring up, the woods grow beautiful and present themselves as a bride and do so to give you joy, that autumn comes and the birds take their departure, not because they count themselves as precious, but no, so that you won't be bored by them, and the wood puts away its finery for the sake of the next time, that is, so it will be able to give you joy the next time. Is this nothing to be joyful about? Learn from the lily then, learn from the bird, for they are masters in the art of existing, of being today, of being joy." Now, of course, Kierkegaard's writing before Darwin. We could well accuse him in this passage of the so-called pathetic fallacy that sees nature as in some way existing for the sake of human needs and as motivated by emotions such as we find in ourselves. But I think that's to take too seriously the sort of rhetorical working of that passage. I'm sure he's aware that objectively nature isn't there in order simply to entertain or edify us. What's at issue in that passage is not nature, but the attitude we take, not only to nature, to the world, but of course to ourselves and to our life in the world. In this sense, the main point is the point made right at the start of the passage. Just think that you exist. Is that not reason for joy? So what I hope to have done in this lecture is to set out a series of interlocking themes in spiritual life. I've suggested that it's possible to make connections between nothingness, gratitude, and the pure love of God. Even though a self that sees itself and its world as nothing and therefore has nothing to thank God for, may nevertheless, at the same time, espouse a pure love of God that isn't dependent on or limited by having something to thank God for, and at the same time has a character that can be appropriately described as gratefulness. Such a love of God is the simple acknowledgement that the confluence of God, world, and self in the passing, insubstantial moment of existence is the matter of joy, and as such, of unlimited transpersonal gratefulness. In a way, it's the human echo of God's judgment in Genesis chapter 1 that the world he has created is good. I have one further comment. Several points I mentioned that the idea of seeing human beings in their world in terms of nothingness particularly undermines an Aristotelian view that approaches phenomena as defined in terms of the particular substantial entity that each is. And it's striking that if we turn to Aristotelian moral psychology, we see that both humility and gratitude are rejected because they seem to undermine the self-sufficiency of a noble soul guided by reason and conscious of its own dignity and worth, which is the Aristotelian ideal. The humble self, an Aristotelian would say, lacks a proper sense of self-respect, and gratitude is likewise demeaning because it puts a person in a position of indebtedness.
These Aristotelian ideas, I think, are alive and well, suitably transformed in many contemporary ways of thinking about what it is to be a self. And many philosophers promote the privileging of autonomy, of self-affirmation, and pride as marks of human dignity. The position I've been outlining is therefore one that's at many points in tension with what many of our contemporaries, especially our secular contemporaries, regard as most valuable and important in striving to become who we are. I hope, however, that they're so far from being incompatible with respect for the dignity of others as to put us in a better position to exercise such respect, since knowing ourselves to be nothing and being grateful for being just this nothing that we are, if we really take that lesson to heart, we have no motivation to be competitors for any rights that others might want to be claiming. But really to open up that question would be to start a whole different paper. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening.